The shoes didn't fit the crime, or the killer. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Type in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? You make this journey unforgettable with every message. Let's begin. You can tell a lot about a person by their shoes, not just the brand or how polished they are, but whether they belong in the closet they're in, which is how I knew we were in for it the moment I opened the hall closet and found a pair of size 11s sitting where Mr. Wolfe's umbrella usually loiters like an old guard dog. They were men's Italian leather wingtips, brown with a buckle, the kind of shoes that say I'm trying too hard in 3 languages. I don't make a habit of rummaging through the closets at Wolfe's place, but Fritz had asked me to grab the old cedar blocks from the top shelf, and I was feeling unusually cooperative after a particularly fine lunch of pork tenderloin with wild rice. That feeling lasted exactly 2 seconds until I saw the shoes. I picked one up, light wear on the sole, scuff on the left toe. Definitely not Wolfe's. His feet are a half-mile shorter and a lifetime less stylish. And while I couldn't swear to it in court, I knew the other 2 people in the house, Fritz and me, weren't storing our kicks in the hall closet, especially not shoes we'd never seen before. So I did what any competent private investigator would do in a house where nothing is supposed to go unaccounted for. I marched into the office and interrupted Nero Wolfe mid-page of Varia Botanica. "Wolfe, we've been infiltrated." He didn't look up. "Then bar the door and tell them I'm indisposed." "I'm serious. There's a pair of shoes in the hall closet. Size 11s. Don't belong to any of us." That got him. His eyes rose from the page and settled on me like a microscope about to diagnose an infection. "You are confident?" "As confident as I am that you'll be ordering Fritz to roast a duck tonight." "Bring them." I did. He studied them without touching them, nose slightly wrinkled as though they smelled of something beyond leather. "Italian," he said. "Hand-stitched. Newer than the dust that coats our threshold. Left without intention. Or with too much of it," I said. He frowned, an acknowledgement that I wasn't entirely wasting oxygen. I added, "Could be a guest, a client, someone passing through." Wolfe closed the book with a soft whoomp. "No one has passed through. The bell hasn't rung. Fritz would not admit a stray without announcing them. You, despite your flaws, would not miss such an event." I like to think so. "Therefore," he said, "we have either an intruder or a deception." Now, Wolfe is not a man easily perturbed, but I could tell the presence of foreign footwear in his sacred brownstone had touched something deeper than irritation. It was, as he might put it, an intellectual insult. He stared at the shoes again, then leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Archie," he said, "find out who was here yesterday after 3 p.m. Ask Fritz. Ask yourself. If necessary, ask the police blotter." "You think it's serious?" "I think," he said, eyes closing, "that someone has placed those shoes where they do not belong, and that they wish us to know they were there or to believe someone else was." "And you're taking the case?" He opened one eye and glared at me. "I do not take the case, Archie. The case has taken me." I left Wolfe to his contemplative glower and went looking for Fritz. If anyone other than me had a key to the quiet little kingdom at West 35th, it was our resident culinary genius. I found him in the kitchen, which was about as surprising as finding water in the ocean. He was peeling shallots with the serene precision of a man who didn't expect size 11s to turn up in his vestibule. "Fritz," I said casually, "did you admit any visitors yesterday afternoon? Say after 3? He glanced up with the gentlest of pauses. "No, Mr. Goodwin. Mr. Wolfe instructed me not to disturb him unless it was Mr. Parker or someone bearing documents from Mr. Kramer. Neither arrived. No deliveries? Packages? Only the usual from the grocer, but those were left at the rear, and I took them in myself. Anyone slip past you?" His mouth twitched, almost a smile. Not unless they came disguised as a sack of fingerling potatoes. I nodded. I liked Fritz too much to needle him when he was clearly innocent. What about guests this week? Anyone leave in a rush? He shook his head. No one has come for 3 days. And did you happen to store a pair of shoes in the hall closet? Shoes? Brown wingtips. Italian. Not yours, not mine, not Wolfe's. Definitely not Saul's. He wears loafers when he's off duty. Fritz looked genuinely disturbed, which was impressive considering he'd once calmly whisked creme anglaise while I was describing a triple homicide. No, Mr. Goodwin. I assure you, nothing has been moved in that closet since Monday. I dusted it myself. That was 2 confirmations. Wolfe hadn't received guests, and Fritz hadn't hidden footwear. I went back to the office. They were not his, I reported. He gave me the shallot oath. Wolfe's eyes were closed again, but I knew better than to assume he wasn't listening. And you? I haven't picked up any shoes since I bought those black derbies 2 months ago, and I definitely don't stuff wingtips into random closets between cases. So, someone entered. Which means one of 2 things, I said, sitting across from him. We've been robbed by a guy with very polite habits, or we've been visited by someone who wanted to leave a calling card with souls. Wolfe's lips flattened, which in his world passes for a grimace. Neither is acceptable. I waited. I've learned that Wolfe often speaks most when he says the least. He was turning it over, threading the logic, tying laces that didn't yet match up. Have Mr. Panzer come tomorrow morning, he said after a pause. 9 o'clock. So we're calling in Saul? He didn't open his eyes. This is not ordinary. Saul is not for ordinary. And in the meantime, you will go to Wilkins and Harrow on Madison. The shoes were sold there. I raised a brow. You got that from the stitching? From the sole, he said. Their exclusive mark. You'll confirm the purchaser. Return swiftly. It was a brisk dismissal by Wolfe standards, so I headed out, pausing at the door just long enough to pick up the shoes. One of them still carried a faint trace of something, cologne or conditioner. I made a note to sniff around that later. Wilkins and Harrow was a high-end shoe boutique run by a man who dressed like a Flemish banker and spoke like he once gave elocution lessons to diplomats. I introduced myself and the shoe, which was enough to earn a tiny bow and a faint, approving smile. Ah, yes, he said, taking the wingtip gently, like it was a Fabergé egg. That's from our March collection, hand-stitched imported buckle. Who bought them? I'm afraid that's private. I showed him my license, but he was unimpressed. So I called Wolfe. 10 minutes later, the phone behind the counter rang. The manager answered, nodded several times with increasing deference, and handed me a file without a word. The name on the receipt was Dr. Howard L. Osterfield. Cash purchase. 2 weeks ago. The address was in the East 60s. Nice neighborhood. I called it into Wolfe as I headed that way, and he told me, in the dulcet tones of someone turning down a mediocre soufflé, do not knock, observe, report. No interviews. I found the building, a trim brown stone 2 blocks from the park. Classy, neat, not the sort of place you'd expect to produce surprise footwear. I circled it once, watched the windows, and saw a woman in a cream blouse close the blinds on the 2nd floor. She didn't look like a housekeeper, more like someone who hadn't expected to be watched. There was a brass plate by the entrance. Dr. Howard L. Osterfield, behavioral consultant. The kind of title that tells you everything and nothing. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't ask what I saw. He just pointed to a slip of paper he'd written in his maddeningly perfect block print. The shoes were not left. They were planted. Why? I read it. Message? Too subtle. Warning? Too small. Mislead? Possibly. Who benefits if we believe someone entered undetected? That stumped me. Somebody who wants to make us nervous? Wolfe shook his head. Archie, we are never nervous. We are occupied. I let that sit. We were still pondering when the doorbell rang. I answered it, because Fritz was reducing a veal stock, and I didn't want to start a kitchen war. The woman on the stoop was the one from the blinds. Cream blouse. Pearl earrings. The kind of posture that tells you she's balancing more than just her handbag. She was composed, but the flicker in her eyes told me she was doing the math on whether this visit was worth it. Mr. Wolfe, she asked. Inside. Name? Eleanor Hart. I believe I need to speak with him about something I may have left here. Or rather, something I didn't. I stepped aside. He's waiting. She walked in like someone walking through fog. Controlled but unsure of the edges. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. Just inclined his head and let his voice drip down like molasses. You are Eleanor Hart. Yes. And you are not surprised that your shoes were found here. Her composure twitched. They weren't mine. Number, but you placed them. That stopped her. She blinked, recovered. I didn't break in. No one accused you of breaking in. I mean, I had a key. That got my full attention. Wolfe remained still. Explain. They were my husband's. I didn't know where else to go. I thought, if you found them, you might call. Indeed. She sat in the red chair I always reserve for the jumpy ones. My husband, she said slowly, was Dr. Howard Osterfield. He died last week. I think he was murdered, and I think I know who did it. But they're not going to believe me, because I can't prove it, unless the shoes help. Wolfe didn't say a word, just folded his hands together. The room was suddenly so quiet you could hear Fritz sharpening a knife 2 rooms away. Mrs. Hart, Wolfe said at last, you may proceed. But be advised, I will not chase shadows. You will give me facts. She nodded. They won't look into it, she said, because they said it was natural causes. But he was never ill. He was only 46, and the night before he died. He said something strange. He said, they want me out of the way, and the next time you see me, it'll be the wrong shoes that prove it. She looked up. That's why I left them here. Wolfe nodded once, then looked at me. Archie, he said, you will speak with Dr. Osterfield's former employer. Discreetly. Begin with the hospital. Sure, I said. But first, what exactly did she mean by a key? Eleanor Hart looked away. I didn't say I had a key. I said I had the key. That, I admit, got even Wolfe's eyes to open a fraction wider. And just like that, we were in it. I admit I've heard stranger things than a grieving widow walking into the brownstone and hinting that she possessed the key to her husband's suspicious death. But not many. And almost never with that much poise, that much precision, or that much mystery packed into so few syllables. Wolfe didn't rise. He didn't need to. He simply adjusted his bulk in the chair and inclined his head like a Roman magistrate preparing to preside over a duel. Mrs. Hart, he said, we will, for the sake of progress, proceed under the assumption that you are not being metaphorical. Kindly clarify. What key? Eleanor Hart gave a little shake of her head. Not a refusal, but more of a delay. She was steadying herself, mentally placing her pieces on the board before making the opening move. My husband kept a journal, she said. I never read it, but I knew it existed. He told me he kept records, psychological markers, he called them, on clients, colleagues, anyone he interacted with professionally. Names coded, but he said the meanings were obvious if you knew the context. Wolfe nodded, barely. He worked in institutional consulting, personnel strategy for hospitals, education boards, behavioral contracts with the city. Quiet work, but it came with access. Oversight committees, review panels. Things people wouldn't want disclosed if someone were writing notes in the margins. And this journal? Wolfe said. That's the key. I don't have it. But I know where it is. Wolfe said nothing, which in his world is a yes with reservations. She went on. Howard had a study in our brownstone. Locked, always locked. He told me once that if anything ever happened to him, sudden illness, accident, anything out of the ordinary, I was to look in the lining of his old briefcase. The leather one with the broken latch. She turned to me. It's still there, under his desk. He always left it there, like a fixture. I was already halfway out of the chair. Wolfe raised a hand, not to stop me, but to steady the air. You said you had a key, he said. Yet you placed shoes in our closet rather than deliver this explanation by telephone. Why? She looked him dead in the eye. Because I didn't want it traced, because I didn't know who to trust, and because I needed to see if you'd take the bait. That impressed even me. Not many people bait Wolfe without getting a verbal rap on the knuckles. He turned his head slightly, which for him was a minor earthquake of interest. And what makes you believe someone killed your husband, Mrs. Hart? Her voice dropped a notch. Because 3 nights before he died, he told me that the next vote on the citywide mental health panel would cost someone their reputation. He said he'd been offered money to abstain, and when he refused, the offer turned into a threat. Wolfe's brows crept upward a fraction. Names? He said. I don't have them, but I think the journal does. That sealed it. Wolfe closed his eyes and leaned back, breathing in like a man who just sniffed out the truffle beneath the leaves. Eleanor, he said, and Wolfe never used a first name lightly. You will not return home alone. Archie will accompany you, secure the briefcase, and confirm the existence of the journal. You will return here with it. Not to the police. Not to friends. Here. She nodded once, sharply. I stood, ready. Wolfe opened his eyes again and gave me a look that translated to hurry, but don't rush. And above all, don't be stupid. On the way to the Hart residence, Eleanor rode in silence. She wasn't shaken, not like someone under threat, but she was wound tight. Not scared, exactly. More like cautious. Alert to shadows. I've seen it in witnesses before. People who think they know something important, but haven't worked out what it is or who might come after them for it. The house matched her. White brick, modest elegance, everything in its place. A widow's house without the mourning curtains. She unlocked the door and let me in, then paused in the entry. He used to pace in here, she said, back and forth before every big decision. Wore down the grain in the floor. Pacing men make enemies, I said. They think too much. The study was small, sharp and sterile. A wall of books, a desk with military neatness, and yes, a battered brown leather briefcase resting like an old dog under the desk. The latch was indeed broken. I crouched, reached inside the inner lining, and found what I was looking for, a slim, flat black moleskin-style journal, wrapped in a thin band of cloth and sealed with a piece of tape. On the cover, written in fine script, Behavioral Offsets, H.O. I slipped it into my coat pocket. Eleanor watched me do it. You're not going to read it? Not here. She looked like she wanted to protest, but then nodded. You're right. It's safer there. We left as quietly as we came, with no signs of visitors or surveillance, but I still felt the prickle on the back of my neck. Someone, somewhere, was missing those shoes, and odds were they'd noticed that the bait had been taken. Back at the brownstone, I handed the journal to Wolfe like it was nitroglycerin. He took it delicately, as if the contents might leap out and start lying on their own. He didn't open it. Eleanor will remain here until further notice, he said. Archie, arrange for the front room to be prepared. I raised a brow. That's a guest room, I said. We don't do guests. We do now. Fritz took the directive with only the mildest arch of the eyebrow. Wolfe gestured Eleanor to the front room, then finally opened the journal. I watched him read. His eyes moved slowly, and his face changed even less than usual, but I could see something shifting behind them. Wolfe was processing, categorizing, comparing names to lists already in his mental archives. After 5 minutes, he closed the journal, steepled his fingers, and addressed the air. 3 candidates, he said. For what? For potential cause. For motive. For fear. He passed the journal to me. I scanned it. It was unsettling. The entries were short, coded, sharp as a scalpel. No names, just initials and observations. MT, obsessive symmetry, threatened twice RA budget decisions. RC, narcissist, manipulative, uses silence as weapon, aware of being watched. FD, oversteps authority, volatile, borderline panic disorder. None of them meant anything to me. Not yet. Wolfe tapped the arm of his chair. A sound of irritation, but also of resolve. Tomorrow you will visit the city office where Dr. Osterfield consulted. You will inquire carefully into the mental health panel's recent disputes. Seek the full names matching those initials. Do not mention Eleanor. Do not mention the journal. I nodded. And if they ask who I am, say you are a behavioral shadow, hired to walk the edge. I grinned. I like it. Cryptic. Stylish. He didn't look amused. Eleanor has placed us in the path of someone cautious, calculating, and desperate. They planted shoes not to mislead, but to distract. A flourish. Meanwhile, the true danger is elsewhere. And the danger to her? That, he said, is precisely what we must now prevent. The brownstone was no longer quiet. It had become a battlefield. The next morning I was back on the street before 9 with a flask of mediocre coffee, a notebook full of cryptic initials, and a mandate from Nero Wolfe that boiled down to uncover but don't disturb the hive yet. Dr. Osterfield had consulted for the citywide mental health panel, which operated out of a modest civic building on the east side. A 4-story brick rectangle that looked like it had once dreamed of being a post office but settled for municipal anonymity. Inside, it smelled like old paper and newer bureaucracy. I flashed a friendly grin at the receptionist and asked for a Mr. Raoul Chen. That was the only one of the initials in Osterfield's journal I'd been able to tentatively connect R.C. And a quick search in the city directory told me he was currently listed as a senior coordinator for the panel. Chen came down 5 minutes later, short and trim, with glasses that looked expensive enough to double as jewelry. He had the kind of handshake that tried to apologize for not liking handshakes. Mr. Goodwin, was it? That's me. I'm following up on an old consulting report Dr. Osterfield submitted. Something about administrative friction on the panel. I was told you might know the players involved. Chen smiled the way you do when someone mentions a problem you've spent your whole week trying not to think about. Howard was insightful. Too insightful, some would say. Some, I echoed, playing dumb. He gestured for me to follow him upstairs. We took a small conference room with a view of a loading dock. Municipal glamour. Dr. Osterfield was brought on during the restructuring last spring, Chen explained. Budget crises, staff turnover, that whole mess. He was meant to assess personalities, suggest who played well with others and who didn't. Like behavioral, matchmaking. Something like that. But the results, let's just say he didn't sugarcoat them. He made a few enemies, including 2 of the commissioners. Initials FD and MT maybe, I said casually. He blinked. How'd you know that? I offered a half smile. Lucky guess. Chen leaned back. Frank Durling, hot temper, hated oversight. Margaret Throp, sharp as a razor but protective to the point of paranoia. Howard said she ruled her staff like a Victorian headmistress. He thought she was hiding something. What about you? He gave me a tight smile. I'm still here. And not dead. I made a mental note. Chen was clever enough to joke about danger without naming names. That made him interesting. Did Dr. Osterfield seem worried near the end? I asked. He hesitated. He seemed careful, like he was measuring every word. And 2 days before he died, he asked me an odd question. Wanted to know if the city had protocols for whistleblowers. Not for himself, he said. Just hypothetically. Huh, I said. Didn't know hypothetical had a death toll. Chen didn't laugh. I thanked him, left a card that I knew would go straight into a locked drawer, and moved on. My next stop was less friendly. The personnel files at City Records. It took some smiling and name-dropping, but I got a peek at Frank Derling's file. He'd been reprimanded twice for inappropriate outbursts and had narrowly avoided a demotion the previous fall. A note in the file mentioned Dr. Osterfield's recommendations, with no further detail. I didn't need a pie chart to guess they weren't flattering. I also pulled Margaret Thropp's profile. A 47-year-old former hospital administrator, she'd been the panel chair for 6 years. Her file was cleaner. Too clean. No disciplinary notes, no complaints. Either she was a saint, or someone had tidied things up nicely. Before heading back, I called Saul Panzer and gave him the rundown. Wolfe had wanted him on standby, and I figured it was time he earned his retainer. Follow Thropp, I told him. Don't spook her. Just see who she talks to, who watches her back. Saul grunted once, his version of understood, and hung up. When I returned to the brownstone, Eleanor was having tea in the dining room, a little paler than the day before, but otherwise composed. Wolfe, naturally, was where I'd left him. In the office, behind the desk, holding still like a statue carved from well-fed contempt. I gave him the report. Names, files, impressions. I even handed over a copy of Derling's personnel reprimands. Wolfe scanned them without comment. So, I said, we've got 3 suspects. Chen, Derling, Thropp. All mentioned in the journal. All had motive. Derling's angry and unstable. Thropp's got secrets and control issues. Chen might be in the clear, or he might be playing the long con with a polite face. Wolfe closed the file and pressed his fingers together like he was praying, but only for the sake of posture. Eleanor, he said, calling to her without looking, when your husband received the threat you mentioned, do you recall precisely how he phrased it? She entered, clutching her tea with both hands. He said, they want me out of the way, and if I don't play along, I'll vanish like a line from a pencil ledger. I blinked. That's a peculiar turn of phrase. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Not peculiar, intentional. He reached into the drawer and pulled out Osterfield's journal again. This time he opened it not to the front, but near the back, flipping through until he found a final page marked only with a date, 3 days before Osterfield's death. A single line read, I know now which one. RC will act last, but MT will act first. Wolfe tapped the journal. The misdirection was deliberate. He knew something was coming, perhaps even left a second record, a ledger, as he put it. You think there's another journal? I asked. Not a journal, a record. Possibly financial, possibly procedural, but it is not here, and he did not destroy it. I was already on my feet. You want me to go back to the Hart place and dig? No, Wolfe said. That would be expected. We must make them come to us. He turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Hart, we will place a notice, tasteful and subtle, in the obituary columns of tomorrow's Gazette. You will draft it. It will include a reference to Dr. Osterfield's unpublished notes on institutional malpractice. Her eyes widened. That'll get their attention. Precisely. It will say nothing actionable, but it will create urgency. I grinned. You're baiting the hook again. I'm presenting a dish, Wolfe said dryly, and observing who salivates. That night, Fritz served duck à l'orange with braised greens, but the real meal was being prepared in the morning paper. I placed the notice exactly as Wolfe instructed. then passed the rest of the evening pretending not to watch Eleanor pace the front parlor. She paused once near the window and said softly, "You know, Howard always said his work would get him killed." I thought he was being dramatic. "People who pay attention to other people usually are," I said. "It's a hazard of the job." Just before midnight, Saul called. "Got movement," he said. "Throp left her apartment around 10. Took a cab. She's at the Osterfield place. She has a key." I relayed this to Wolfe. "Let her search," he said. "Let her find nothing. She won't take the shoes." "She won't touch them," Wolfe replied. "They're already accounted for. She's looking for something else. And when she doesn't find it, then she will come here," Wolfe said, "and present her mistake." I leaned against the office wall, watching the master at work. Not with blueprints or bulletins, but with psychology, anticipation, and timing. We were in position. Now all we needed was the first knock. The knock came at 8:42 a.m. the next morning. Not the tentative tap of a nervous petitioner or the righteous hammering of a district attorney. This knock was deliberate. 2 short raps, a pause, then one more. As though the person on the other side wanted to suggest they weren't here by chance, but by strategy. Fritz opened the door, and I heard the smooth, low voice before I saw her. "I believe Mr. Wolfe is expecting me." Margaret Throp stepped inside like she owned the floorboards. Mid-40s, compact, hair slicked back in a twist so tight it could cut wire. She wore a navy suit with a collar so sharp it looked like it came with a liability clause. Her eyes were clinical, appraising, and just a little too alert for a casual morning visit. Wolfe didn't rise naturally. He gestured at the red chair. She didn't sit. "You know why I'm here," she said, crossing the room with the smoothness of a woman who'd never been told no and didn't intend to start learning. "I do not," Wolfe said. "I rarely presume. It clouds deduction. I read the notice in the Gazette." Her voice was low and even, but I could hear the tension underneath, like a violin string tuned a half step too high. "I'm here to tell you it's a mistake." "What is?" "Publishing that, hinting that Dr. Osterfield left behind damaging notes. You've made yourself a target." I glanced at Wolfe, but his gaze didn't flicker. "I do not frighten easily, Miss Throp. I merely inquire." Her arms tightened across her chest. "You're barking up the wrong tree." "A curious metaphor, given the circumstances," Wolfe said dryly. "And an interesting position to take, given your uninvited search of the late doctor's home last night." That stopped her. She didn't flinch, but her stance shifted, fractionally. But I caught it. So did Wolfe. "I was trying to prevent exactly this," she said carefully. "Howard was not a well man in the end. He was paranoid. He saw enemies everywhere. Yet you took the time to look for his journal. I was looking for his files, to ensure nothing confidential was released that might harm others unfairly. The panel's integrity is at stake." Wolfe closed his eyes, his voice dipping into something soft and deadly. "The integrity of the panel ceased to concern Dr. Osterfield the moment it ceased to concern you." She exhaled. Not a sigh, exactly, but something adjacent. "You don't understand how delicate it is. The funding, the contracts, we're talking about millions in mental health grants. If he made unfounded accusations—" "I have read the journal," Wolfe said. That hit her. She dropped into the red chair as if her knees remembered something her spine didn't. "So he did keep one," she said. Wolfe gestured lazily. "More than a journal, a map of manipulation, and a statement of fear, not of death, of erasure. He believed someone would destroy more than his life, his work. And you think I did it?" Wolfe gave her a long, disdainful look. "You visited a dead man's home unannounced in the dead of night to retrieve something he may have left. You threatened me, albeit politely. You do not protest your innocence. You insist on your importance." She didn't respond. I stepped in. "You left the shoes, didn't you?" That brought her head around fast. What? Size 11s. Brown leather. Italian buckle. Planted in Wolfe's hall closet. You wanted to see if someone would find them. Wanted to know how fast we'd react. She blinked. Those weren't mine. So you're admitting you weren't the first one in? Wolfe's fingers drummed on the chair. Number, she's admitting she doesn't understand the game as well as she thought. I don't like being cornered, she said quietly. No one does, Wolfe replied. But you misunderstand me. You are not the mouse. You are merely in the maze. She stood. You can't prove anything. You don't have a crime. Howard died of a heart attack. There's no trail. I do not need a trail, Wolfe said. I only need a motive, and you've offered several. She hesitated, and then, for the first time, looked genuinely uneasy. Not guilty, not panicked, but uneasy. I didn't kill him, she said finally. Wolfe nodded once. You may go. She didn't argue. She walked out with her back perfectly straight and her exit timed to the second. We didn't speak until the door closed behind her. Well, I said, she's lying. But what about? She feared the notice, Wolfe said. And she feared being second. I blinked. Second to what? To discovery, to exposure. She thought Osterfield had left only one record, but he left two. I raised an eyebrow. You're sure? Yes, and the second is financial. How do you know? Wolfe opened the drawer again and held up a small folded slip of paper I hadn't seen before. On it was a simple column of letters and numbers. A code. Found this in the journal's back flap, he said. It's a ledger index. I leaned in. Bank account? Possibly. More likely a routing map. If I had the original ledger, I could confirm. But the question now is not what it leads to. It is who else knows it exists. Just then, the phone rang. Fritz passed it to me. Saul Panzer. Chen's on the move, he said. Left his apartment 30 minutes ago, headed for the Hart place. He's not alone. He's with Durling. That was enough for Wolfe. Intercept them, he said to me. No confrontation. Follow, see what they want, and bring Eleanor back here immediately. She cannot return to that house again. I was out the door in less than 2 minutes, racing up 10th in a cab and making it to Eleanor's place, just as Chen and Durling were walking up the steps. I stayed across the street, watching. They didn't knock. Chen produced a key. Durling glanced behind them once, then they went in. 2 minutes later, Eleanor arrived in another cab, holding a small envelope in her hand. She looked puzzled. I caught her before she reached the steps and steered her back to the car. What's going on? She asked. They're inside, I said, and I don't think they're here for tea. She looked down at the envelope in her hand. This was on my apartment door, she said. No name. No note. Just this. Inside was a small photograph, blurry but distinct enough. It showed the ledger, or at least part of it. I frowned. Someone wants you to know it's real? No, she said slowly. Someone wants me to look for it, or pretend I have it. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe examined the photo without comment. Photocopy, he said. Grainy. Intentional. Not proof. A prompt? Prompt for what? Eleanor asked. To flush out the original, or the person who's hiding it. He turned to me. Archie, you will return to Osterfield's study. Search everything. Not for what's visible, for what's missing. Missing? Yes. Someone is already searching. We will find what they failed to find. And if they find it first? Wolfe's voice was low and sharp. Then someone else dies. Perhaps Mrs. Hart Eleanor didn't flinch. I want to know who killed him, she said. Not just for me, for him. Wolfe's eyes closed, then opened again. Then we must follow the money and the fear. I nodded and reached for my coat. It was time to go back to the beginning and hope that this time we weren't the ones being baited. I arrived at the late Dr. Osterfield's townhouse shortly after 11 a.m., equipped with a slim toolkit a pocket flashlight, and Wolfe's voice in my ear, reminding me to look not for what was there, but for what had gone missing, which is just like Wolfe. He sends me to dig for something invisible and expects results by lunch. The place was locked, but I'd kept the spare key Eleanor had used the day before. Inside, nothing looked disturbed at first glance. No overturned drawers, no chaos. But that only meant the people searching were careful or clever, or both, maybe even professionals. I moved straight to the study, bypassing the temptation of the kitchen and its untouched espresso machine. The desk was as we'd left it, the old briefcase back in place. The journal had already been removed, so I checked every surface for impressions. Nothing on the blotter pad, no markings on the leather top. I knelt beside the desk and started tapping the panels, hollow in some places, solid in others. One tap under the left bottom drawer gave a curious echo. I pulled the drawer out completely and checked underneath. Bingo. A slim, discolored patch of wood, warmer than the rest. A false bottom. Pried it open with a flathead screwdriver and found nothing. Well, almost nothing. A small brass hinge was still screwed into the edge, but whatever had been attached to it was gone. The space was just large enough to fit a notebook or a slim folder. Someone had already beaten me to the prize. I sat back and scanned the room again. Still too neat, which meant they'd either taken what they wanted and left everything else untouched, or they hadn't found it all. I worked methodically, under the couch cushions, behind the books, inside every folder. One volume on the psychology of deception had a slightly stiffer spine. I opened it and flipped through. Around page 173, a crisp corner revealed a tiny sheet folded 4 times over. I unfolded it. A note, in Osterfield's handwriting. If you are reading this, you found the fake compartment. Good. Now look where the balance tips. Paper hides paper. That was it. Cryptic, sure, but also unmistakably deliberate. I stood, holding the note, and looked again at the bookcase. Where the balance tips? Paper hides paper. There was a thick row of medical journals on the top shelf, maybe 30 in all, precisely arranged. But one volume, a 2019 issue of the Journal of Behavioral Ethics, leaned half an inch farther than the rest. I pulled it free. Inside was a sealed manila envelope. I opened it. What I found wasn't a journal or a confession. It was better. Copies of municipal fund reports, appointment rosters, and a typed letter, unsigned, outlining what Osterfield had referred to in his notes as contractual redirection. In plain English, someone on the mental health panel had rerouted a sizable chunk of funding, hundreds of thousands, through a dummy non-profit called Civic Light Strategies. The paper trail was faint, but it was there. The kicker, a handwritten postscript, likely from Osterfield himself. Chen knows. Durling agreed. But she authorized it. If it leaks, they'll all turn on each other. It's my leverage. Or it was. I didn't stop to admire it. I folded the letter into my inner pocket, sealed the rest back into the envelope, and locked the door on the way out. I didn't need to be spotted by anyone who might want to know what I'd found. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't speak while I delivered the envelope to his desk. He unfolded each sheet with the slow reverence of a man peeling a delicate pastry. This, he murmured, is not just motive. It is a fulcrum. Meaning, he laid one hand on the journal, the other on the new documents. It explains why Osterfield was killed. It explains why the shoes were planted, and it explains why someone would risk exposure to find what was already missing. Eleanor sat across from him, watching silently. When Wolfe finished reading, he looked up. Your husband discovered a funding manipulation. He traced it. He documented it. He feared retaliation. So he created 2 caches, one coded, one literal. The journal was his warning. This, he tapped the envelope, was his proof. Which means, I said, whoever killed him needed to find both before someone else did. Wolfe nodded. They failed. And now, with that obituary, they believe someone else has succeeded. There was a pause, like the room itself held its breath. Then Eleanor said, "So what happens now?" Wolfe shifted his bulk slightly and closed his eyes. "Now, we invite our guests." That afternoon I made 4 phone calls, each with precise wording and a deadline. Be at the brownstone at 6 o'clock sharp. Wolfe had information to share regarding the Osterfield matter. I didn't mention the police, but I didn't have to. The undertone was clear. At 6 on the dot, the suspects arrived. Margaret Throp, composed but tight-lipped. Frank Durling, sweating under his collar despite the air conditioning. Raoul Chen, calm on the outside but tapping his foot like a Morse code key. Eleanor sat to the side, still and unreadable. Wolfe opened with no fanfare. "Thank you for coming. We are gathered here because a man is dead. Officially, Dr. Howard Osterfield suffered a cardiac event. But unofficially, he died of something far more insidious. Pressure." Throp scoffed softly. Wolfe ignored her. "Doctor, Osterfield discovered irregularities, not errors, intentions, redirected funds, phony invoices, procedural manipulation, and he was preparing to report them." Durling started to protest, but Wolfe raised a finger. "You may deny nothing until I am finished." He held up the journal, then the manila folder. "These are not allegations. They are records. Your names appear within them, directly or indirectly. But more importantly, your behaviors betray you." Chen frowned. "This is absurd." "Is it?" Wolfe said. "Let us examine what we know." He leaned forward slightly, an inch, no more, but the effect was electric. "Mr. Chen, you visited the Osterfield residence last night, unannounced and in the company of Mr. Durling." Chen's jaw tightened. "Mr. Durling," Wolfe continued, "you are the only one of the 3 with documented episodes of rage, 2 formal reprimands. And Ms. Throp, Margaret, you entered the home first, alone, and you left the shoes, not to mislead me, but to gauge me, to see if I would act." Her mouth opened, closed. She said nothing. Wolfe turned to Eleanor. "Your husband anticipated his end. He left clues, subtle ones. He trusted you to notice. You did." He stood. Not fully, just enough to change the gravity in the room. "One of you killed him, not with poison or a blow, but with fear. You applied pressure. You threatened reputation. You let him believe there was no escape. And someone, perhaps one, perhaps all, crossed a line." There was silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, Raoul Chen spoke. "I told him to report it. I warned him to go public." Durling turned sharply. "What the hell, Raoul? I didn't kill him," Chen said. "But I saw what Margaret was doing, how she twisted the vote." Throp shot to her feet. "You liar! You signed off on those transfers." Wolfe sighed. "So, there it is." He turned to me. "Call Inspector Kramer." That got a groan from everyone, even Eleanor. "What are you telling him?" Durling asked. "That I have evidence of criminal misconduct," Wolfe said. "Fraud, conspiracy, and emotional coercion so severe it led to a man's death." Throp was trembling. "That's not murder." "No," Wolfe said, "but it is justice." The room was silent. Even the walls held still. Then Wolfe added, almost gently, "Doctor, Osterfield was not killed with violence. He was removed, through design. But now the design collapses." And with that, the game ended. The sound that followed Wolfe's last words wasn't anything you could put in a transcript. It wasn't outrage, or shock, or even denial. It was the collective unraveling of control, a quiet exhale of masks slipping, defenses faltering, the kind of silence that tells you everything important is happening without anyone saying a word. Frank Durling looked like he wanted to explode, but didn't know who to explode at. Raoul Chen was stone-faced, calculating odds like a man trying to salvage a sinking boat by moving deck chairs. And Margaret Throp, well, Margaret didn't move, didn't blink. She just stared at Wolfe, eyes narrowing by millimeters, as though trying to determine whether she could make him go away with sheer willpower. She couldn't. No one ever has. "Archie," Wolfe said without looking away from her, "you will ensure that Mr. Kramer is informed of what has transpired. Present him with the documents, the journal, the financial trail. Allow him to determine the appropriate charge." "Gladly," I said, already reaching for the folder on Wolfe's desk. Margaret spoke for the first time since her outburst. "There is no charge, no body, no poison, no murder weapon. This is insinuation dressed up in elegant vocabulary." Wolfe regarded her with faint contempt. "You mistake the mechanism for the act. This was not homicide in the common sense. It was intellectual violence, institutional murder. You constructed a trap with reputational ruin as bait and watched a man wither inside it." "That isn't a crime," she said. "No," Wolfe admitted, "but it should be." Frank Durling gave a sudden, bitter laugh. "I told her it was going too far. I told her Osterfield was cracking." "Yet you assisted her," Wolfe said. "Why?" He looked down at his shoes, then back at me, as though I might offer a more forgiving expression than the one Wolfe wore. "I didn't. They threatened to fire me," he muttered. "Said I'd be blacklisted from any city contract if I didn't go along. Margaret said all we needed was leverage, that Osterfield was a problem and problems got managed." "Did you speak with him directly?" "No," he said. "Chen did. I stayed out of it." Wolfe turned his gaze to Raoul Chen, who had remained silent through the entire exchange. Chen finally said, "I told him to run. I said if he leaked what he found, it would take the whole panel down, and he'd be buried under the fallout. I gave him a choice. He didn't want to believe it." "That," Wolfe said, "is the most honest thing anyone in this room has said." Chen didn't reply. Eleanor had stayed silent through most of this, sitting like a shadow just beyond the perimeter of conflict. Now she spoke, her voice as steady as I'd ever heard it. "He left me a letter. I found it last night inside a book I'd never touched before. He said he wasn't afraid to die, but he was afraid to disappear. He didn't want to be rewritten." Wolfe inclined his head. "And he won't be," he said. "You have seen to that." Chen stood abruptly. "So what now? We go to jail?" Wolfe's eyes closed for a moment. "That is not for me to decide. I am not the law. I'm only its reminder." I rose, collecting the folder and slipping it into a leather case. "Kramer's going to love this," I said. "Nothing like a bureaucratic scandal wrapped in psychological sabotage and high-minded cruelty." Durling swore under his breath. "You're handing him our careers." "No," Wolfe said without a trace of sympathy. "You did that yourselves." They filed out slowly, like retreating soldiers after a lost battle. Margaret was the last to leave, pausing at the door for one final look at Wolfe. "I suppose you think you've won." He opened his eyes just enough to meet hers. "I do not think in terms of winning. I think in terms of balance." She didn't respond, just turned and left. When the door closed, the brownstone exhaled. Fritz, who had been hovering in the hallway with the air of a butler waiting for a siege to end, returned to the kitchen. Wolfe settled back into his chair like gravity had remembered him. Eleanor sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. I could tell she wasn't quite ready to ask the question, so I did. "Will Kramer be able to pin anything more than corruption on them?" "Unlikely," Wolfe said. "Unless one of them cracks, which I suspect Mr. Durling might. He is morally unstable and emotionally undisciplined. But even lacking a confession, the financial misconduct is enough to destroy reputations and derail careers." "And Osterfield?" His name will be cleared, his notes authenticated, his findings vindicated. I turned to Eleanor. Not the kind of justice people cheer for, but the kind that lasts. She nodded slowly. It's enough. Not everything, but enough. Wolfe's eyes opened again. May I offer you some advice, Mrs. Hart? She looked at him with something halfway between wariness and gratitude. Of course. You are young, intelligent, principled, I believe. Do not let your husband's death turn you bitter. That is what his enemies would have wanted. That is how they survive, by transforming the opposition into reflections of themselves. She absorbed that, then gave the faintest smile. I'll try. Wolfe nodded, which for him is the equivalent of a standing ovation. Eleanor stood and looked around the room for the first time with something like peace. I suppose this is the end, then. No, Wolfe said. Merely the last page. She left not long after, refusing an escort, but promising to keep in touch if the inquiry developed further. I watched her go from the front window, then wandered back into the office. Wolfe was already back to reading An Orchid Excursion in Malay, his thumb marking the page with the indifference of a man who has solved his quota of human cruelty for the week. So, I said, another chapter closed. One man dead, 3 careers in shambles, and the brownstone restored to its natural state, morally superior and freshly vacuumed. Wolfe grunted. You seem less triumphant than usual, I added. He didn't look up. Triumph implies contest. This was not a contest. It was a rot, and we excised it. I sat, stretching out. Still, not bad for a pair of wrong shoes. At that, Wolfe finally looked up, mildly amused. They were the wrong shoes, he said. In the wrong place. But the right clue. He closed the book and set it aside. Dinner. Fritz arrived just in time with a roast squab in red wine reduction, and silence settled over the brownstone like an old friend. After dinner, I cleaned up, filed the case notes, and poured myself a finger of brandy. Wolfe didn't speak again until I was halfway to the door. Archie. Yeah? He didn't look at me, just stared at the fireplace. It is easy to blame systems, or villains, or inevitability, but in truth, the most dangerous thing is the silent complicity of those who watch and do nothing. I raised my glass. Then here's to the ones who don't. He nodded once. And that was the end of it. No parade, no headlines, just a clean, restored brownstone, a woman with her truth back, and 3 people who'd never be able to explain how a pair of shoes cost them everything. We've had messier cases, louder ones, but none, perhaps, so quiet and cutting as this one. Nero Wolfe and the wrong shoes in the closet. Case closed. It was the 3rd morning after the case concluded, and the brownstone had returned to its sacred rhythm. Orchid maintenance from 9 to 11, lunch precisely at 1, and the blissful hum of unread correspondence being ignored in the office while Wolfe sat, statue-like, behind his desk pretending the world didn't exist unless it had the courtesy to send a check. We hadn't heard from Kramer, which in Wolfe's view meant the evidence had done its work. Wolfe considered Inspector Kramer's silence an acceptable substitute for praise, as long as it came with an arrest or 2. I was filing the Osterfield documents in our steel cabinet, under O, right next to a case involving a fraudulent otolaryngologist and a forged inheritance, when the mail arrived. Fritz passed me the stack. 3rd item down, a long envelope bearing the official seal of the New York District Attorney's Office. Wolfe, I called, tossing it lightly onto his desk. You've received love notes from the city. He opened it with a paper knife, eyes moving left to right without any change of expression. He set the letter down, then looked at me. Durling confessed. Really? I said. Voluntarily. Apparently. The DA will issue a formal statement tomorrow. Durling admitted to undue psychological coercion and complicity in administrative conspiracy. Miss Throp and Mr. Chen have both resigned from the panel. Disgraced and discarded, I said, sitting. A lovely outcome, considering nobody swung a fist or fired a shot. Wolfe closed his eyes. The mind is a more effective weapon if properly wielded. You should get that printed on a mug, I said. He ignored that, naturally. Eleanor called earlier, he said. You were out. She asked to relay her thanks again. The university offered her a position in their ethics department. She has accepted. I smiled. She'll be teaching ethics in the aftermath of institutional sabotage and psychological warfare. That's poetic. Indeed, and appropriate. She has earned the right to repair. That was Wolfe. He'd never call it justice, not when no one went to prison for murder. But in his mind, repair was sometimes the more radical form of justice. Eleanor Hart had been brave enough to follow a breadcrumb trail into a nest of corruption and smart enough to come to the one man in New York who would neither betray her trust nor pity her grief. Wolfe had respected that. Not openly, of course. But then again, he rarely does anything openly except breathe and complain. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the windowsill. Outside, the street rolled on like nothing had happened. But inside, the residue of the case lingered in the air, like dust in a sunbeam. I still keep thinking about the shoes, I said. Who planted them exactly? Throp denied it, but she was the one who entered first. But the style didn't fit her. Too bold, too masculine. Precisely, Wolfe said. You think she had someone else plant them? Number I believe she borrowed them. From Durling, most likely. His taste was less refined and the size aligns. She needed a gesture, a clue subtle enough to be noticed but vague enough to deny. Why plant them here? To see if I would take the bait, Wolfe said. And more importantly, to see if Eleanor would. They did not know what Howard had told her before his death. She never told them about the key. No, Wolfe said, because she never told anyone. And had she not come to us, the journal would likely have been destroyed during their search. Their plan was thorough, but flawed. They understood policy, not psychology. I walked to the bookcase, where the Austerfield Journal now sat sealed in a manila folder between 2 volumes on ethics and mental manipulation. You're going to keep it? Yes. Why? Because someday, he said, someone else will try the same thing, and I will be prepared. He was quiet for a moment, which in Wolfe's world is often more revealing than a monologue. Then he added, the most dangerous minds are not the ones who commit crimes, Archie. They are the ones who justify them. That landed. We sat in silence for a while, broken only by the tick of the wall clock and the far-off hiss of Fritz blanching vegetables in the kitchen. Then the doorbell rang. Pfui, Wolfe muttered, which was his usual blessing for anyone foolish enough to disturb him before lunch. I answered it. A courier, thin, bored, and carrying a narrow box. Delivery for Mr. Wolfe. Signature, please. I signed, tipped him, and brought the box inside. Wolfe looked at it like it might explode. It didn't. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a pair of pristine, custom-made brown leather wingtips. Italian, size 11. There was no note. Wolfe stared at them for a long moment, then turned to me. Well, I said, someone's got a sense of humor. They have my attention, he said quietly. You think it's Throp? Possibly. Or Chen? Or perhaps someone we overlooked. A quiet admirer, or a lingering threat. Should I burn them? I asked. Number put them in the vault. The vault? He nodded. Let them sit. Sometimes, Archie, it is useful to preserve a question. I placed the shoes in the safe behind the bookcase, beside our case backups and a few items I'm not legally supposed to know Wolfe keeps. He returned to his orchids, and I returned to my coffee. Outside, the city hummed along, unconcerned, unaware, unchanged. Inside, the brownstone had survived another assault. Not physical, not noisy, but an intrusion nonetheless. On Wolfe's order, on my rhythm, and on the fragile balance between what we know and what we pretend not to. A man had died, not murdered with a gun, but with pressure, isolation, and strategic silence. We hadn't caught a killer in the traditional sense. We'd caught a system of selfishness, and we dismantled it, quietly, thoroughly, and with precision. I leaned back in my chair and raised my mug in Wolfe's direction. "To the next pair of wrong shoes," I said. He didn't look up, but I swear, just for a second, the corner of his mouth twitched. The 9th morning after the shoes appeared, the wrong shoes in the wrong place, broke with a rare moment of uninterrupted calm in the brownstone. No knocks, no calls, no mystery telegrams dropped off by shaky-fingered messengers trying to whisper without being seen. Just the hum of city traffic outside, the soft clink of porcelain from Fritz preparing breakfast, and the rustle of Wolfe's morning paper. All in all, it was the sort of silence that made me nervous. It was too quiet. I'd lived long enough in Wolfe's employ to know that cases, even when closed, rarely ended neatly. They stopped, they paused, they frayed at the edges. But true endings, Wolfe didn't believe in them, and frankly, neither did I. So I wasn't shocked when the phone rang during my second cup of coffee, and Fritz handed it to me with a raised eyebrow and a dry, "It's for you, not business, but close." It was Eleanor Hart. "I'm sorry to call," she said. "I know it's early." "Not a problem," I said. "What's going on? Trouble?" "Not exactly." She hesitated. "I received something. I wasn't sure whether to bring it to the police or to you." "Which means it's something odd," I said, "and probably shaped like a metaphor." She laughed softly, the first real laugh I'd heard from her since this all started. "It's a box, wrapped in gray paper. No return address. Inside is another pair of shoes." That got my full attention. "Eleanor," I said, standing up, "stay inside. Lock the doors. I'm coming over." I didn't bother telling Wolfe until I was halfway down the steps. He called out behind me, "Do not tamper. Observe and report. Bring the object." "Right," I muttered. "Observe the metaphor. Report the threat. Carry the footwear." 10 minutes later, I was standing in Eleanor's foyer, staring down at the box on her kitchen table. She hadn't opened it further than necessary. Just enough to see what was inside and to recognize the message. The shoes were black, patent leather, men's formal and brand new, still laced with stuffing paper. But unlike the last pair, these came with something extra. A card. Typed plain. "The wrong shoes may be yours next time." Charming. I bagged everything, box, shoes, note, and returned to the brownstone. Wolfe didn't even wait for me to speak. He took one look at the shoes and said, "Not Durling." I raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" He nodded. "Too theatrical, too precise. This is someone with flair and malice. Durling lacks the former. Chen lacks the latter. Throp might possess both, but she no longer has motive. She's buried under reputational ruin. So this is someone else." "Yes." "Someone we missed?" "No," he said, sitting back. "Someone we ignored." That was Wolfe at his most frustrating, full of implied knowledge and zero willingness to part with it before his mental souffle had risen. I knew the look, eyes half closed, head tilted, fingers steepled like a stained glass saint having a theological debate with himself. "Eleanor's safe?" I asked. "For now, but this is not about her." "No, she's the one who got the shoes." "She's the message board," Wolfe said. "Not the message." I paused. "You think this is about you?" "Of course it is. The first pair was bait. This pair is a warning. The sender has escalated from curiosity to threat." I nodded. "So we poke the bear and see if it growls?" "No," Wolfe said. "We wait." That stopped me. Wait. Yes. The moment will come. When a person reveals themselves fully, it is rarely in motion, it is in stillness. We will apply no pressure, we will only observe. And for 2 days, we did. No new packages, no strange calls, no visitors. Wolfe resumed his orchid schedule. Fritz resumed buttering toast with surgical precision. I resumed keeping my jacket on indoors, just in case I had to move fast. Then, on the 3rd night, I caught a shadow. Around 10:43 p.m., while checking the lock on the front vestibule, I noticed the faintest shift in the hedge outside. Not movement exactly, just a shape that wasn't there a moment before. I waited. 30 seconds later, someone stepped forward. Slow, deliberate. It was Saul Panzer. I opened the door before he could ring. "You're early," I said. "I'm not here for you," he replied. He walked past me and into the office. Wolfe, who had been reading, looked up and said nothing. Saul stood in front of the desk and laid down a small rectangular photo. "I saw him 2 hours ago," he said, "at a club on 38th. Not the kind with dancing." The photo showed a man in his early 50s, grey at the temples, glasses, sharp cheekbones. His name was Victor Barron. Wolfe had mentioned him once during the case, in passing. Osterfield's predecessor on the mental health panel. Quietly retired last year after a vague reorganization. No scandal, no complaint, just gone. "I thought he was out of the picture," Saul said, "until I saw him watching Eleanor Hart's apartment. Same guy, 2 nights in a row." I turned to Wolfe. "Was he in the journal?" "Briefly," Wolfe said. "1 note. VB, too clean to be clean." That was all. "Why didn't you pursue it?" "Because I assumed Osterfield was mistaken," Wolfe said. "But I was wrong." Wolfe stood. "Call Miss Hart. Have her come here. Now." 15 minutes later, Eleanor walked in wearing a dark coat and a wary expression. Wolfe gestured her to the red chair. "Do you know a man named Victor Barron?" she thought. "Yes, barely. He was Howard's mentor. Stepped down last year. Howard said something once, that Victor taught him everything except when to stop." "Did Victor ever visit your home?" "Number Y." Wolfe nodded. "Because he believes the journal should not have survived, and that the shoes were his message." She was quiet. Then, almost a whisper, "He blames me." "No," Wolfe said. "He blames your husband. You are merely the surviving symbol of a mistake." "Then what do we do?" Wolfe looked at me. "Find him. Tonight. If he watches her. Building again, confront him, but only speak. No threats. Offer him an exit." "Why give him a way out?" I asked. "Because," Wolfe said, "men like Barron will destroy everything rather than lose face. If we corner him, he'll lash out. But if we let him retreat, he might crumble." I went. And sure enough, at midnight, Victor Barron was there, standing across the street from Eleanor's building, wearing a wool coat and an expression like a man caught between regret and rage. I approached slowly. "Mr. Barron." He turned, didn't look surprised. "I knew someone would come." "I'm not here to accuse you," I said. "I'm here to ask why you wanted her to be afraid." He blinked. "I didn't." I raised an eyebrow. "I wanted her to know what it was like," he said, "to carry a name that gets erased." "Howard wasn't trying to erase you," I said. "He was trying to survive you." He looked down, then back up. "I just wanted to be left out of it." "You were. Until you sent the shoes." He nodded, slowly. "I was afraid he'd written more. That she'd publish it, that I'd be part of the fallout." I paused. "You can walk away now. This ends tonight, but if you so much as send another message, Wolfe won't stay out of it." He nodded again, and then he left. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting. "Well?" he asked. He won't bother her again. Wolfe closed his eyes and whispered, "Balance restored." I said, "For now." He nodded. "That's all we ever get." And that was enough. Case concluded again. The 10th morning began like most in the brownstone. Too early for Wolfe, too quiet for me, and too symmetrical for Fritz, who was rearranging the lemons in the fruit bowl to face the same direction. Outside, New York coughed itself awake, but inside, we were sealed tight. The wrong shoes, the right questions, and a dead man's shadow had finally faded from the threshold. It should have felt like an ending. It didn't. Wolfe was in the plant rooms, and I was at my desk pretending to organize the receipts from a 3-week-old expense report that involved 2 cab rides, a bribe for a janitor, and a bowl of rice pudding I was still regretting. The doorbell rang. "Expecting anyone?" I called toward the kitchen. "No," Fritz replied, the O clipped as if the question had insulted him. I opened the door to find a courier, different from the one who brought the second pair of shoes. Younger and nervous. He handed me a slim envelope and said, "I was paid to deliver this in person. Said it was personal. No signature." I thanked him, closed the door, and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of linen paper, typed. No header. "You think the balance has been restored, but justice comes in increments, not conclusions. Tell Wolfe that some shoes can't be removed, only worn until the soul gives out." There was no name, no logo, no threat, but the implication was as thick as the paper. I took it straight to Wolfe, who had just returned from his orchids with the same expression he wears after interacting with anything outside genus Paphiopedilum. He read the note, his eyes flicking faster than usual, then handed it back to me without comment. "Well?" I asked. He settled behind his desk. A final signal. "From who?" "Baron. You think he's still trying to scare us?" "Number I think he's trying to justify himself. Perhaps to us, perhaps to himself." I reread the note. "Some shoes can't be removed. What do you make of that?" Wolfe leaned back, his gaze distant. "Guilt, Archie, is not always a burden. Sometimes it becomes a uniform. Men like Baron wear it because it reminds them they once mattered. Even disgrace can be a kind of proof that they were significant. That's bleak. It's honest." I folded the note and filed it under postscript, miscellaneous, which in our office is a drawer filled with the lingering thoughts of people who couldn't quite let go. Most of them don't matter. A few do. That afternoon, Eleanor stopped by unannounced. Fritz tried to redirect her, but she insisted. Wolfe, seeing her at the threshold, actually stood to greet her. Mark your calendar. "I won't stay long," she said. I needed to close the circle." "Is it open?" Wolfe asked. "In a way," she said. "I've moved. New address, new job. But I still wake up some mornings wondering whether Howard knew. I mean, really knew how dangerous it had become." "He knew," Wolfe said softly. "The journal makes it plain. He knew the risks. But he hoped, wrongly, that reason might still carry weight in a system built on denial." She nodded. "I think he always believed too much in logic. It was his strength and his blind spot." "Then he was not alone," Wolfe said. They were quiet for a moment. I let the silence linger because some silences do more work than words ever could. Finally, Eleanor asked, "What will you do with the journal?" "Nothing," Wolfe said, "unless it becomes relevant again." She hesitated. "Would you ever publish it?" "No," he said. "It is a warning, not a weapon. If it were to be used publicly, it would need context, and the world has no patience for context." She smiled faintly. "I think Howard would have liked you." Wolfe lifted one brow. "I would have found him exhausting." We saw her to the door, and she left without looking back. The days that followed were uneventful in the way only a New York spring can be. Light rain, mild scandal in the papers. 2 clients who wanted to hire us for cases that weren't cases. Wolfe turned them both down, of course. "I have had my fill of institutional egos for the quarter," he said, which in Wolfe speak was a rare emotional hangover. Then came the dinner. Roast pheasant with rosemary potatoes. One of Fritz's specialties. Wolfe savored it like a man forgiving the universe. Halfway through, he said, "You were right." I stopped chewing. "I was? Could you repeat that for the record?" He ignored me. "About the shoes. They were not just a clue. They were an opening move. Barron's way of declaring the board was still set?" "Yes," Wolfe said, "and that the players had not yet stopped moving." I poured myself a glass of wine. "But it's over now, right?" Wolfe didn't answer immediately. He forked a piece of pheasant and regarded it like it had just asked him to dance. "Do you recall what I told you at the start? You've said a lot of things at a lot of starts. You'll have to narrow it down." That the case had taken me. I nodded. "Yeah, you said that after the shoes showed up." "And I meant it," Wolfe said. "But now, I release it." There was something in the way he said it. Formal, almost ritualistic. Wolfe rarely admitted emotional investment, but when he did, it came like an eclipse. Silent. Rare. Total. "You ever get tired of it?" I asked. "The liars. The gaslighting. The games constantly," he said. "But the alternative is surrender, and I have no appetite for that." The rest of the evening passed in companionable silence. I cleaned up the dishes. Wolfe returned to his chair, and I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Not the smug kind, but the tired, earned kind that comes when you know the truth got out, even if justice had to come in whispers. Later, I checked the safe. The first pair of shoes was still there, resting quietly in the dark. I thought of Osterfield's journal, of Throp's fury, of Durling's guilt, of Barron's last note. Some shoes, I thought, do get worn out. Others just wait for the next man to try them on. I closed the safe, turned the bolt, and walked upstairs to bed. Behind me, the brownstone sighed into stillness again. It was 3 weeks after the second pair of shoes landed at Eleanor Hart's door, and Wolfe had declared the case released. Not solved, released, which in Wolfe's lexicon meant the questions had been answered, the pressure had lifted, and the threads, however frayed, had been tied off in something approximating order. But for me, the final knot came on a Wednesday. I was in the front room, sorting mail and pretending not to be waiting for something, anything unusual. Fritz was in the kitchen coercing Lamb into submission, and Wolfe was, predictably, among his orchids, whispering sweet nothings to a phalaenopsis that had finally decided to bloom after months of stubborn silence. That's when the doorbell rang. A single chime. I opened it to find Saul Panzer standing on the stoop with a small flat box under his arm and the ghost of a smile on his face. "I've got your missing piece," he said. He stepped in, handed me the box, and added, "You're going to want Wolfe for this." I didn't wait. I went to the plant rooms. "Wolfe," I called, "Panzer's brought a puzzle piece." "It's in a box. Want to take bets on whether it's another pair of shoes?" He grunted. "No wagering. Bring it." By the time I returned to the office, Wolfe was back in his chair and Saul was standing by the globe. I set the box on Wolfe's desk. He opened it without ceremony. Inside was a pair of photographs. Not shoes. Black and white. Grainy, but clear enough. The first showed Victor Barron in a dim cafe, passing an envelope to a man with his back to the camera. The second showed the same man's face. A face Wolfe and I had both seen exactly once, early in the case, at the Wilkins and Harrow boutique. The salesman. Wolfe leaned forward ever so slightly. "Explain," Saul obliged. "I had a hunch. You said the first shoes weren't just planted, they were borrowed. So I went back to the store, poked around, checked deliveries, Turns out Baron didn't buy the shoes. He rented them off the books from the clerk. Quiet deal. Cash. Just for an hour. And the clerk never mentioned it, I said. No reason to, Saul replied. Unless someone asked the right question, which I did. Wolfe tapped the edge of the photo. Then Baron planted the first shoes himself. Used Durling size to obscure the trail. Intended to implicate, distract, or both. Exactly. I nodded slowly. Which makes the real story even simpler. And uglier. Indeed, Wolfe said. Victor Baron wasn't just trying to scare Eleanor. He was trying to rewrite the case from the ground up. To make it so tangled in misdirection that no one could name the cause of death. Wolfe turned to me. Osterfield knew, and Baron knew he knew. Which means, I said, that between the threats, the financial trail, and the journal, Osterfield was a liability to everyone in that room, but only Baron had motive to act alone. And to vanish while the others took the fall, Wolfe added. A coward's finale. We sat in silence a moment. Then Wolfe said, "You will take this to Inspector Kramer. Tell him that while the legal angle is fragile, the moral indictment is complete. Think he'll press charges?" "No," Wolfe said. "But he'll watch Baron. And sometimes, that's enough." Not very poetic. "No," Wolfe said, "but efficient." That night, Eleanor came to dinner. We didn't talk about the case. We didn't need to. She brought a bottle of wine. Fritz made coq au vin, and Wolfe permitted the smallest indulgence, a toast. "To honesty," she said, raising her glass. Hard won and rarely welcomed. Wolfe didn't toast. He never did. But he nodded, and in his world, that was thunderous approval. After she left, Wolfe and I sat in the office with coffee. I said, "You never did say why this one got under your skin." He didn't answer at first, just sipped his coffee and stared at the fire. Then, because it came too close. The planting of those shoes wasn't just an insult. It was a message. I can enter your sanctuary without knocking. But you figured it out. I did, he said. But not before someone else paid the price. That's not on you. Isn't it? He asked. I didn't answer. Sometimes the smartest thing you can say to Wolfe is nothing. We sat a while longer, and then Wolfe stood. That's right, stood. He crossed to the safe, opened it, and took out the shoes. The first pair, the wrong shoes. He held them like they might speak. Then he turned to me. "Archie, take these to the incinerator. Burn them thoroughly." I blinked. "You're sure?" "Yes. Their meaning has expired." And so I did. Down the back stairs, into the alley, fed them to fire. No headlines, no crowds, no applause. Just the quiet end of a mystery built on pride, pressure, and perfectly polished leather. When I returned, Wolfe was reading again. The office was still. And for once, so was I. Case closed. For good this time.